So from time to time you may hear that an Apple product officially becomes vintage or obsolete. Apple uses these two terms to describe the age of a product and how much support it gets. Now, what it really means is for vintage that a product hasn't been made in 5 years. So for instance, say you buy a MacBook and say that MacBook is actually manufactured for an entire year before a new MacBook replaces it. When they stop manufacturing it, that's when the clock starts ticking. And after 5 years it's vintage. And after 7 years it's obsolete. What's the difference between vintage and obsolete? Well, if you're anywhere in the world except California and Turkey, they're the same thing. Vintage and obsolete mean the same. In California and Turkey, vintage means one thing and obsolete means another because of consumer laws in those areas. So does that mean that Apple stopped supporting your Mac at that time? Well, not necessarily. It actually means something very specific. This page goes into detail describing exactly what Apple means by vintage and obsolete, and even goes and looks at specific Mac models, iPhone, iPad models, all sorts of things. I mean, even the Apple II is listed here. And what it really means is that Apple doesn't supply replacement parts anymore. So let's say you have a vintage or obsolete Mac and you take it to a repair shop and needs a new part. If it's not vintage or obsolete, then that repair shop can go to Apple and order a replacement part. But once it's vintage or obsolete, then they can no longer get replacement parts from Apple. Doesn't mean they can't find replacement parts somewhere. Doesn't mean they can't take an off the shelf part. Like for instance, hard drives are made by a number of manufacturers. But something like maybe a specific part of the case may be something that's only made from Apple. So you may still be able to get it repaired, especially if the part doesn't come from Apple. But it's going to be a lot harder to get Apple specific parts at that point. However, it doesn't have anything to do really with software. When you think about it, there certainly are machines that are older than 7 years now that actually will run High Sierra. So Apple is supporting them with providing new operating system updates, providing updates for Pages, Numbers, Keynote, and all of that. And these machines support that, and the software developing will run on these machines. So software support is still there. Of course, at some point those machines are too old to run the most current systems, but it usually goes much more than 5 years. Apple still also provides support in things like the Genius Bar. And certainly you get software help there. You get help with any of the current software or issues you may be having with using iCloud, things like that. So even though your Mac may actually be vintage or obsolete, you can still go to the Genius Bar and ask questions and get a lot of different kinds of help from Apple. So it really only applies to specific parts for repair. And it's a pretty good system. I mean, after all, Apple manufactures these machines and then they move on to new designs and new interior parts and all of that. But they still keep enough parts around to provide repair shops with those parts if they need them for 5 to 7 years afterwards.